And this is that famous account of Jesus healing a blind beggar. And in fact, this is the very final miracle of Jesus in all of the gospel records. And this is a wonderful account that displays in many ways the marks of a true and a saving faith. But it also reveals for us, yet again, the very character and the very heart of our Lord. And so that in and of itself is what makes our time and focus on this text here this morning very much worth it. And so just by way of introducing this, let me begin our time by simply reading the text for us just to get it before us, and then we'll take a closer look at the meaning of these words. And so again, this is chapter 18 of Luke's Gospel and verses 35 through 43. Let me read this for you. Luke says, by way of the inspiration of the Spirit, "And as Jesus was approaching Jericho, there was a blind man sitting by the road begging. And hearing a crowd going by, he began to inquire what this was. And they told him that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. And he called out, saying, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And those who led the way were sternly telling him to be quiet. But he kept crying out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and commanded that he be brought to him. And when he came near, he questioned him, asking, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And he said, 'Lord, I want to regain my sight.' And Jesus said to him, 'Receive your sight, for your faith has saved you.' And immediately he regained his sight and began following him, glorifying God. And when all the people saw it, they gave praise to God." Well, as we saw last time, we are now in the final days of Jesus' ministry. In fact, we are now just days from Jesus entering into Jerusalem. And so in that sense, there are just a matter of days left in Jesus' life. In fact, there's maybe a little bit over a week and a half before his crucifixion. And so in every sense of the term, we are now at the very beginning of the end. And we have still got several chapters in the Gospel of Luke before we get to the cross. And so while we're roughly about a week and a half out from that very important event, as far as we're concerned as a church, we still have a number of years left in this gospel. And because frankly, once we get into Jerusalem, things will begin to slow down and become highly dramatic and actually very dark, and not only in terms of what happens to Jesus, but primarily as well in the very things that he himself will teach. And so the whole ethos of this gospel is going to shift in some significant ways. But before we step into the experience of the final week of Jesus' life, which again is dramatic, it's ominous, it's dark, what we have here are two final conversion stories in which the grace and the mercy of God is once again put on a wonderful display for us. And so in that sense, before the darkness of Jerusalem, we're given a little bit of light. And so the first one will be our passage here this morning regarding this blind man. And then the second one is what we'll, Lord willing, take a look at next time, which is that very famous account of Zacchaeus, who was a wee little man. And so let's take a look at the first one here this morning with the healing of this blind man, who though he be blind, he sees something significant. He has spiritual eyes to see what many who see do not see. And this is an important account, and because it's recorded for us, actually both in Matthew and Mark as well. And so we're going to try and fill out the story a little bit by bringing the accounts together to get a fuller picture of this event. And so let's get into it by taking a look, first of all, at the setting. Let me try and build out the scene for us here a little bit. And so notice again, verse 35, Luke writes these words. He says, "And as Jesus was approaching Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road and begging." Now, again, Jesus here is headed to Jerusalem. We established that last time. I don't have the ability or time to develop that for you here right now, but he has got this massive crowd that is following him. In fact, Matthew and Mark state that explicitly. And so Jesus has been making his way to Jerusalem, and the interest in him is heightening. And so everywhere he goes, this crowd just keeps getting larger. In fact, the crowd at this point is exceptionally large. They've been large, but at this point it is uniquely large. And because in addition to the intrigue surrounding the person of Jesus, there is also the great fact of the Feast of Passover. And so as all of Israel would be headed to Jerusalem at this point, starting way up in the north in Galilee, as Jesus has been rolling through the various cities, the various villages, they're all joining him as they make their pilgrimage down to Jerusalem for Passover. And because, again, his reputation and his fame at this point is the story of Israel. And so as they're coming down from Galilee, they all cross east over the Jordan River into a place called Perea. And because, remember, they always avoid Samaria. Samaria was that tainted land, and because it was the place of the Samaritan, the hated half-breeds, half Jew, half Gentile, the product of intermarriage between Israel and foreign nations during the time of their exile. And so the pure-blooded Jew despised the Samaritan, and so they wouldn't step foot in their land lest they become unclean, and so they always go around Samaria. And so once they have cleared Samaria as they're heading south, they come back west over the Jordan and then continue their descent to Jerusalem, which is actually very close. And the very first city, once they cross back over the Jordan, is this city of Jericho. And so this is where we are in this text. Now, the detail of Jericho is significant. In fact, Jericho, if you didn't know, it's called the City of Palms, and because it's filled with date palms. It was a city that was fed by springs from the Jordan River, and so it was irrigated, it was luscious, it was rich in terms of resources, it was very productive. They had all kinds of fruit trees, figs, almonds, even rose plants, and so it was a very fruitful city, and it was known for its beauty in many ways. In fact, it was so luscious and magnificent that Mark Antony gifted it to Cleopatra about 100 years prior to this very event. And Cleopatra, she had a very large nose. I was looking at a bust of her, and she had a large nose, and I wondered why she had such a large nose. And I looked it up, and she actually is said to have seduced Mark Antony with her large nose. And then Blaise Pascal said, had her nose been a little bit shorter, the history of our world would be very different. And because Mark Antony, he was general in the Roman army, and he basically is responsible for turning Rome from a republic to a autocracy. And so things would be very different. And so for those of you women who have large noses, maybe you could change the world. Or at the very least, seduce somebody. This has nothing to do with anything. But it was a beautiful city, and it was gifted to her, and that's all you need to know. Herod as well, he loved the city so much. He built a palace there. He made it the place where he would go and die, and so it was a booming city in the first century world. Now, most of you know Jericho from the Old Testament. It was that famous city that Israel marched around for 7 days, and then on the seventh time around, on the seventh day, the walls collapsed. And so we are familiar with that city. And by the way, if you didn't know, what's fascinating about Jericho is that archaeology has discovered that the walls have actually fallen outward. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that there was no military conquest moving in on the city. And so just an interesting fact in light of the biblical record. Now, in the days of Jesus, there were actually two separate Jerichos. There's the Old Testament city that we usually think about, and then there's the New Testament city here that we have in our text. And the Old Testament Jericho is just a little bit northeast of the New Testament city, and that's an important point to know. And because in Matthew's account of this, he says that this takes place as Jesus was leaving Jericho. And then Mark says in his account of this that this takes place as Jesus came to Jericho. And then Luke here says that this takes place as they were entering Jericho. And so, of course, all the skeptics want to jump on that and talk about all the contradictions of Scripture, and because apparently your faith is supposed to rest on whether or not Jesus was coming in or out of a city. But the reality is there were two Jerichos, and so perhaps Matthew's point is simply to say that they were leaving the Old Testament city of Jericho, and whereas Mark and Luke indicate that they were approaching the New Testament city. And in fact, Mark's construction is written with something called an infinitive clause in the Greek, which would actually mean something like in the area of Jericho. And so however you want to harmonize the three differing details, the combined point is that this is taking place in the area of Jericho. Now, Jericho, it's also an important detail in this text, and because it is the lowest city on earth. It sits about 800 feet below sea level. In fact, it sits just northeast of the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on earth. And so before Jesus will make his 3,000-foot hike up to Jerusalem, which is about 6 miles, it's fitting that we're brought low here one last time to be reminded of why Jesus needs to ascend to Jerusalem and specifically unto a cross. And so in a sense, we're brought low here geographically, but to one last time be brought low spiritually as we encounter these two lowlifes, frankly, from a Jewish perspective, which of course are the blind beggar, and then this man named Zacchaeus. And so just thematically, Luke is doing something here and indicating that this event takes place in Jericho. And by the way, the response of these two sinners will also be significant, and because they will then go up with Jesus and follow him as he makes his ascent to Jerusalem and his ascent onto a cross, and then, of course, his ascent to the right hand of the Father, but none of that can happen until they are first brought low here to see their need. Now, there are a few different characters in this text. First of all, we've got the blind beggar. Second of all, of course, we've got Jesus himself. And then third of all, we've got the crowds. And all three of these are significant, and they will therefore control, in a sense, our outline for this morning. Now, you've got to picture the scene here a little bit, but as Jesus is making his way with this crowd and drawing near to Jericho, you've got this massive caravan of thousands of people that are entering into the city. And Jesus he's coming to Jericho because you have to go through Jericho to get up to Jerusalem. But as they're coming, they're making all their noise, they're kicking up all of their dust. And so as you can imagine, the people of Jericho are coming out of their homes, they're beginning to line the streets, they're wondering what in the world is going on. They're beginning to talk, and especially as they learn that Jesus, who they have heard so much about, is among that crowd. And so in the midst of all of that chaos, all of that commotion and energy, there is sitting alongside of the road this blind beggar, forgotten, hopeless, helpless, and Mark tells us shrouded under a cloak. And he is totally forgotten, totally rejected, totally despised, and hopeless. And in every sense of that term. In fact, as I was reflecting on this passage this week, it once again reminded me of though we can sometimes feel that God somehow forgets about us, or how could God possibly have any thought of me, just given the busyness and the chaos of this universe. The reality is that he doesn't forget about us. Rather, his eyes are searching constantly for one, even one who is humble of heart, lowly of heart. In fact, let me just say that if you came in here this morning and you were burdened with the reality of your own sin, and you were burdened with your own failures, and your sin is in a sense before your eyes, and you're wondering how God could possibly turn his gaze toward you or hear your cry, well, the reality of this text is that he does. If you are humble of heart, he sees you. In fact, as we'll see, he has his ear here uniquely attuned for the cry of the heart that is humble. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what you have done, as long as you are humble. And it's interesting, but Matthew here tells us that there's actually two blind beggars in this scene. Luke narrows in here on just one of them, and Mark, he actually gives us his name. which is Bartimaeus. And it is a wonderful account. And so let's meet this man. Let's meet Bartimaeus. Now, first of all, there were a lot of blind people in the first century world. We know this, especially in the land of Israel. Physical blindness was a severe problem. It was ubiquitous. It came from birth defects. In fact, it often even came from birth itself. In fact, it was known as something as ophthalmia, which is basically a kind of gonorrhea of the eyes. In fact, as you could imagine, hygiene was just not a premium in the first century world. And so as little babies would pass through the birth canal, they could pick up the infection actually pretty easily. And it would often cause them to go blind. And so blindness, but especially infant blindness, was a serious problem in this day. And then add to that blindness came often through poverty. It came through sickness, came through unsanitary conditions, fights, wars, all kinds of things, infectious organisms. And so it was just a tough thing to have to live in the first century world. And so since there was no government assistance in this day, the blind were relegated to having to beg. Nobody would hire them. Nobody wanted to hire them. And because they had absolutely nothing to offer, they were pretty useless in that sense. And then what made it even worse was the theological perspective of the Jews, which is that if you were blind, then it was because you were a sinner. And you weren't just a sinner, but you were a significant sinner, a major sinner. You were uniquely wretched. And so again, we're back to the question of the disciples in John chapter 9 who come to Jesus and they ask him the question, and Rabbi, who sinned, right? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? And so to be blind was to be suffering the just consequences of your own sinfulness. And so this is God's judgment. This is God's wrath upon you, and it's what you're rightly owed. And so it'd be very difficult to want to even show mercy to a blind beggar, and because, in a sense, to help him would be to be interfering with the very judgment of God. And in Bartimaeus, he would have known this. He was a Jew. He was living in the land of Israel, and so he understood that his suffering was due to the just consequences of his own sinfulness, his own guilt. This was the theological perspective from which even he would be operating, and this was his lot. And so he'd be living perhaps also in the state of shame and guilt, incredible guilt, internal guilt. In fact, I imagine that he spent his life wondering what he could have done differently, regretting his sin, regretting his decisions. If I would have just done this differently, if I would have just done that differently, then I wouldn't be in this position. In fact, notice the detail of verse 41. Notice what he says, where he tells Jesus that he wants to regain his sight. And what does that imply? Well, it implies that he wasn't actually born this way, right? Rather, at some point, he lost it. You can't regain what you never had. And so what would that do? Well, at the very least, it would cause him to carry an even greater guilt, and because his blindness was due to nobody else's sin but his own. His life is what it is, but because of his own folly, his own sinful choices, his own decisions. And again, their theology, it was highly covenantal, and so from their perspective, your blindness could be due to the sinfulness of your parents. Again, John chapter 9, if your parents were sinful, then the consequences of their sins would fall to the next generation, which would be you. But in this man's case, he can't even play victim. Rather, his blindness is due to his own sin. And so even in his own mind, he knows what he is. He is a wretched sinner. He is living under the guilt of his own transgressions. And what he knows is that God, therefore, despises him. And people despise him. He's got no money, no home, no family. In fact, his family would have distanced themselves long ago, and because he is an unclean sinner with zero ability to make any of this right, and he is just too far gone, and so his family must distance themselves in order to maintain honor in this honor and shame society. And so even his family has deserted him, And then add to that he cannot offer any kind of sacrifice, and because he's got no money, and so he can't buy an animal, and so he is still dead in his sins. And so this is a man who is stuck in the prison of his past sins with no way out. No hope, no prospect, no way to undo any of this. And so he is a condemned man before God, and nobody pities him. And he knows it. He is condemned in both this life and in the next. There's no way out. And then beyond that, there is just the reality that he will always be blind. Even that common grace of being able to see will never be his to experience again. And I have to imagine that going blind is far worse than being born blind, and because you will always live with a frame of reference. And so this is misery. This is hopelessness. And so in verse 36, notice, Luke says, "Now hearing a crowd going by, he began to inquire what this was." Now, as you know, sometimes when one sense goes out, then another sense is heightened, right? And so Luke is very intentional here. Notice he says that, and hearing a crowd, he begins to inquire. And that is a key word in this text, and especially because hearing is a critical component to salvation. And so here's a man who is forced into having to open up his ears and just listen. And if you can't see, then it also means that you probably can't be doing a whole lot of talking either, right? Not if you're going to be hearing. And so he is forced and outside of his own will into just needing to be quiet and listen. In fact, let me just say here that given the theme of this man being low in this text, he's low geographically, he is low financially, he is low sinfully, he is low spiritually, he's even low physically, and because Mark says that he is sitting under his cloak. But the theme here of being low is that it's a testimony to the fact that sometimes God permits a person to be brought low and frankly lower than they could ever even imagine. This is how he works. And in order that they might finally be made to see their need. In fact, again, the term regain here means that he was stripped of his sight. And in fact, in that sense, you could say that God is permitting this man's affliction. He is permitting this man's suffering, but for his own good. In fact, let me just say here that some of you in this room don't even yet know perhaps what awaits for you still in this life and the purposes of God. In fact, some of you remain unconverted here still this morning and don't yet embrace the gospel and follow after Jesus because you still haven't been made low enough. You haven't become desperate enough. You haven't yet seen your need where you've been stripped of something that is so precious to you, to where you will have no option but to cry out to your Maker. And you say, well, I would definitely never serve a God like that. Well, the reason you say that now is because you still haven't been made low enough. To the point of where you have no option, to where you finally must bow the knee. And because God uses the school of affliction to break pride. This is how he works. And it strikes me that Bartimaeus and his friend have probably been blind for a while. And so in God's purposes, he permits his blindness, but so that his ears might be open, notice, for a providential moment such as this. For this very moment in which Jesus will pass him by. And yet it strikes me because this is a moment that wouldn't happen for years down the road from the moment of his blindness. The fact is, sometimes We can't see what God is doing in the moment, but he always has a purpose. For those who will have spiritual eyes to see and spiritual ears to hear. In fact, that is even the very testimony of some of you. That God allowed you to break, but in order for you to finally humble yourself before him. He had to allow you to be stripped of something in your life. And essentially in theme with the passage here, but in order to shut you up. And so that all you can do is just listen. And then when you were at your lowest of the low, what happened? Jesus came walking by, right? In the form of somebody bringing to you the gospel. And you heard of this Jesus. But had you not been brought low, you wouldn't have had ears to hear. Your eyes still would have been cast on everything else. You would have been self-sufficient. You still would have been talking from your own pride about how you're going to fix this, your problem, whatever it is, and so you wouldn't have had ears to hear. But this man here, he's forced into a place of finally just needing to close his mouth and not being allowed to have his eyes on anything else and just listen. And so he begins to inquire, which, by the way, is a statement that stands in contrast to the disciples in verse 34, who, remember, after not understanding anything that Jesus was telling to them, they don't ask him anything, right? They don't ask him anything. And why? Well, because at this point, they still think that they know. They think that they know the ways of life and the ways of the world and the ways of God. And yet this man, this nothing low life in the eyes of the Jew, he begins to inquire. And because he's finally been humbled and kept in that state for a significant period of time. And what does he hear? Verse 37, well, he hears that Jesus of Nazareth is about to pass him by. And again, what stands out in this text is that this is the only time that Jesus will pass him by, right? This is it. And yet if he wasn't brought low, he wouldn't have known his need. And if he wouldn't have known his need, he wouldn't have felt his desperation. And if he wouldn't have felt his desperation in this moment for which it was most critical for him to feel desperate, which is this providential moment in which Jesus passes him by, then he wouldn't have been saved. But sometimes people need to be brought low for a significant period of time, but so that they might come to the end of themselves. Because pride breaks hard. In fact, sometimes people, they go through difficulty and then they just get angry, right? And then that anger turns into bitterness, and then that bitterness turns into numbness. And sometimes people never get out of that. And their self-pitying pride where they feel that God owes them something. But for others, sometimes God uses it to break that person's pride and to begin to humble them. To bring them to the very end of themselves so that they might finally begin to see their need and then get to that place where they have nothing to do and they have nowhere to go, and so they're left with only one option, which is to just cry out. To cry out to God. And again, by the grace and the mercy of God, some of you know what this is. And because this is your story. And in fact, this is what this man does. Verse 38. Notice, so in verse 37, they tell him that this is Jesus of Nazareth. And then in verse 38, this man who can't see physically is seeing a whole lot more spiritually than any of these people standing next to him. And so what does he do? Well, he calls out to Jesus, the verb here of boao, which is a verb of loud crying. And what does he say? Well, he says, "And Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Not so why has this happened to me, but have mercy on me. Now, the contrast here is the point to observe. And because, well, the people here are identifying Jesus by his hometown, which is something very typical that you would do in this culture. What does this man do? Well, he immediately identifies Jesus for who he really is, which notice is that he is the son of David. He is king. And that is an important detail because it reveals what this man is believing and knowing to be true about Jesus. In fact, notice he is not asking here a question. He is not asking, so are you the son of David? But rather, he attributes it to him, or he asserts it about him. And so in a sense, this is a confession. He says that you are the son of David, so have mercy. And so what is he believing? Well, he is believing that Jesus is the messianic heir to the throne of David. He is king. He is God's king. Which, by the way, is an incredible thing to believe as a forgotten beggar relegated to the dusty corner of some city. And because how could he possibly know that, right? How could he know that? Well, again, if you're blind and you're unemployed, then you've got a lot of time to just sit and think, right? And this man is a Jew. He was raised in the synagogue. He was catechized in the Jewish faith since he was a little boy. He understands 2 Samuel chapter 7, which is that great passage about the Davidic covenant, where God had promised David that he's going to have a son who will rule eternally from a throne. And so whoever that was going to be the Messiah. He was going to be the Redeemer. He was going to be the eternally anointed king. This is the son of David. And so it came to be a messianic title. And so as this man hears the stories of Jesus and he hears the rumors of Jesus, what does he do? He begins to put two and two together. And again, how? Well, because having been forced to just be shut up into silence and just listen and to dwell on the meaning of the scriptures, he thinks. And he understands the times. You don't need eyes for that. And so while all these people in these crowds are thinking that this might be the Messiah, the reality is he is still just Jesus of Nazareth to them. He is a good teacher. He is some kind of prophet. He works miracles. He can bake a lot of bread. But though this man be blind, he sees here what the seeing do not. And he cries out to Jesus for mercy. And the term mercy, by the way, is always associated in Luke with sin, with the forgiveness of sin. And so he is asking here for mercy, but because he believes, as any good Jew would, that his blindness is due to his sin. And because if it wasn't due to his sin, he'd be asking for healing. He'd be asked to be made well, but he certainly wouldn't be crying out for mercy. And so bound up with the cry of mercy is a cry for forgiveness. In fact, this was the very cry of King David himself in Psalm 51. And you know it. He says this. He says, "And have mercy on me, O God, according to your loving kindness." And why? Verse 3, "For I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me." And so though this man is blind, what he still has before his eyes constantly is the reality of his own sin, his transgressions. And it's haunting him. And so the cry for mercy is always tied to cry to be forgiven, to be made clean. And again, what's implied if you're crying out for mercy? Well, the implication is that it's not owed. It's not owed. And because again, what is mercy? Well, mercy is not giving to a person what they're rightly owed, which is a righteous punishment for sin. And so this man, seeing who Jesus is spiritually through the hearing of him, and then knowing who he is before him, which is a justly and righteously condemned sinner, he cries out for mercy. And why? Well, because among many other things, he has probably heard that Jesus is also exceedingly merciful. And so what is this cry? Well, it's an act of faith. This man cries out, but from a heart of faith. In fact, it's what Paul says in Romans chapter 10 when he says, "And how will people call on him, that is, cry out to him, in whom they have not believed or have faith? And how will they believe in him in whom they have not heard?" And so here's a man who has heard, and so he believes, and then in his belief or faith, he cries out. And so what happens in verse 39? Well, notice Luke says, "And those who led the way were sternly rebuking him to be quiet. But he kept crying out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.'" Now, why would these people rebuke him? Well, because first of all, it's in their theology to do so. Jesus can't be bothered with blind beggars. Most of all, they're just outside Jerusalem at this point. There's a massive crowd. Jesus is going to do big things. The kingdom is almost here. And so Jesus can't be bothered with this man. In fact, it's the same term we see attributed to the disciples up in verse 15 when they begin rebuking the crowds and preventing from all the little children from coming to Jesus. And so just like the disciples earlier, these people leading the way are believing that Jesus has just got far more important issues to deal with, and so he can't be bothered with a blind, begging lowlife who will have no use once the kingdom is established. You're a person justly suffering for your sins. This is what you're owed, so be quiet. In fact, there are always people who think they're doing the work of God, right? Doing great things for Jesus, but the reality is no one has actually asked them to do it. Self-appointed leaders, self-appointed teachers, self-appointed YouTubers who think that the kingdom's success is somehow dependent upon them. And so there are people out in front trying to lead a movement, trying to lead a reformation, building a platform, thinking that they're leading the way for Jesus, and yet they're just hindering the kingdom. But it's the blind, sinful, lowly beggar here who has really seen Jesus as the Christ and as King. There's a great difference between those who think that they need to do something for Jesus and those who know that Jesus needs to do something for them spiritually. And yet, while they don't know much, what they do know is that Jesus has come to serve them. And so Bartimaeus, who's been forced into just listening, he all of a sudden can't be silenced. In fact, you have to appreciate his heart at this point. He will not be knocked down or beaten into submission by all these people who think that they know better. He will not allow the fear of man to hinder his need to get to Christ. In fact, perhaps there are some here this morning who are beginning to see your need for Jesus, but the problem is you've got friends, you've got family, you've got whoever it is, and in a sense, they're preventing you from crying out to Christ as you ought, and because you have fear of man. You have fear of what people might think of you if you become a Christian. Maybe they'll mock you, maybe they think you're just going through a phase that you got to get through, and so you just keep listening to their voices. It's causing you to shrink back, and so you're not crying out as you ought. Here's a model. Here's a perfect example. Notice this man cannot be silenced. He knew his need. He came to see the poverty of his own soul before his Lord, before his maker. And so in seeing Jesus for who he really was, though he had no physical sight, he cries out here in faith. The eyes of his heart here had come to see the truth long before his physical eyes. And so he cries out all the more. In fact, it's the verb krazo, which it's an onomatopoeic term, which means to cry from the heart in an intense way. In fact, it's the verb often associated with the cries of the insane, with epileptics, with even the demon-possessed. In fact, it's a verb that will often be used to speak of a woman in childbirth. And so we're talking here about a severe outburst of desperation. This man knew what he was, and He knew what he needed. He knew that he was a great sinner and utterly helpless, and yet walking before him is hope. And so all he cares about is getting to Jesus. But again, it required him here to first be stripped of something and made low. And so this is Bartimaeus. But then notice the second character of the story, who of course is Jesus, verse 40. Luke says this. He says, "But Jesus stopped and commanded that he be brought to him." Now, first of all, just given the procession that we saw last time, remember you've got Jesus leading out in front, then behind him are the 12, and then behind the 12 are the great crowds. And so in a sense, they're heading up to Jerusalem here. And so in a sense, Jesus here is functioning like a general who's commanding his troops. In fact, the verb command is the language which speaks of a commanding king. And so these people who think that they're doing the work of the kingdom, Jesus needs to instruct. And so what Jesus here is doing is saying effectively, so if you want to be my disciples, then your task is never to prevent people from getting to me. Rather, your job is to bring them to me. You don't keep sinners out, you bring sinners in. This is what it'll mean to be a soldier in the kingdom of God. And so in hearing their king's command, notice they immediately change their attitude. In fact, Mark states in Mark chapter 10 and verse 49 that Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." And then they called the blind man, saying, "Take courage." So now they're comforting. "And arise, for he, Jesus, is calling for you." And I wish we had the time to develop the profundity of that phrase there, of what it means for Jesus to set his eyes on you and call for you. And what does the man do? Well, Mark says, "And casting aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus." It was an irresistible call. And so what is this? Well, it's an act symbolizing faith. And in fact, what he's doing here is what the rich young ruler just prior to this couldn't do. The rich young ruler couldn't give anything up to follow Jesus despite all that he had, and yet this man here throws off probably the only thing that he does have. And so he throws off his cloak, he shoots up, and he comes to Jesus immediately. And so at the end of verse 40, notice Jesus begins to question him. And what does he ask? Well, verse 41, he asks, "And what do you want me to do for you?" What do you want me to do for you? Now, I love this verse, and because notice, Jesus doesn't put up any barriers, right? He is not questioning him as to how genuine he is. He's not asking him about his sin. He's not asking him about his history. He is not asking him what he might be able to offer the kingdom. He is not making certain that he's got his doctrine of the hypostatic union in order. He's not trying to see if this man is worth his time. Rather, notice, as the sovereign God of the universe who has condescended to redeem sinners, and he took on flesh to do so, he comes near, he hears this man's cry, and he stops. In the midst of all the commotion, he stops, and what does he do? He tunes his ear for the cry, and then begins to inquire how he might serve him, this one who is unworthy with nothing to offer. Kings are served, but kings do not serve. But this one does. And so it's just, again, another testimony as to the character of our God. It's the essence of what he means, that he did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom, which is what he's going to do at the top of that ascent, just days from now for this man. And what does this man say? End of verse 41, he says this. Notice he says, "And Lord." Catch that? Again, this man, he's got a profound theology. In fact, this man understands just about everything that you could understand about Jesus up to this point. He understands him as Lord. He understands him as Messiah. He understands him certainly to be the son of David and therefore the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. He understood him as one who is compassionate and abounding in mercy, and therefore one who forgives sin. And so this man who cannot see, he sees profoundly, vividly, with clear spiritual eyes. And he's got an amazing theology of Jesus. And why? Well, because he's forced into having to just listen and think through being stripped of everything. And so in being brought low, Jesus here passes by in this providential moment for this man. And so he comes to Jesus. He comes to the very right source, just like the rich young ruler. What does he say? He says, I want to regain my sight. I want to see. I want to see. Which, again, is a plea for forgiveness as well. And because in his thinking, his blindness is due to his sin. And so what does Jesus do? Verse 42. And Jesus said to him, and by the way, Matthew adds at this point, and being moved with compassion, but Jesus said to him, receive your sight, your faith has saved you. And as one man pointed out, I love how understated this is. Notice he doesn't say that the earth shook, or that the heavens split, or that angels began to sing, or that the Spirit of God was felt by all. Rather, notice it's just so simple, so understated. He simply says, with his word, which again is always where the power of life abides. It's in his word. But he says in a very simple term here, receive your sight, and he is healed. He just says it. No dramatics, no theatrics, no whipping up of the emotions of the crowd, no asking everybody to stretch out their hand toward this man as Jesus prays repetitive sounding prayers in a spiritual sounding way with his Holy Joe intonation. Rather, as the sovereign God of the universe who holds all things in the very palm of his hand, and even down to the tiniest little quark in this man's retina, he fixes his eyes. He simply commands his eyes to see. And what I like about this healing is once again how much it stands out in contrast to the fake so-called faith healers of our day, right? And because, notice, when Jesus heals, it's not only immediate, verse 43, but it is also full and undeniable, and everybody here knows it. There's no therapy that's needed. There's no multiple attempts. There's no praying for the man and then asking, did it work? Which happened to me one time. Rather, his healings are always demonstrable. That is to say, as one man pointed out, he is not healing here lower back pain or fibromyalgia. You can fake healing low back pain, but you can't fake the healing of a blind man who everybody knows has been blind for a very long time. And so his healings were total, they were instantaneous, they were verifiable, and they were inexplicable any other way than that of divine intervention. And by the way, that is true for all the apostles as well, all throughout the book of Acts. They were instant, they were full, they were verifiable, and they were permanent. And so the man confesses Jesus as Lord and Messiah and the Son of David. And then what does Jesus do? Well, he affirms the confession with the healing, which again is the purpose of miracles. They are always designed to confirm the truth, right? The authenticity of the truth. And by the way, this phrase here of your faith has made you well, we've seen this now multiple times, chapter 5, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 17. It is the Greek word sozo, which is literally the verb which means to be saved. In fact, there is a very good Greek word here that Luke could have used, especially being a physician that he is by trade. It's the word haomai, but that is not what he uses. Rather, notice, well, you can't notice, but he uses the verb sozo, which is the only New Testament word for salvation. And so what is the point? Well, the point is that while faith is not necessary for healing, and because it's not, Jesus healed people all the time who had no faith. We've seen that. That was very common and because the power to heal abides in him, not in the faith of the one who needs to be healed. But while faith isn't necessary for healing, what is the point? Well, the point is that it is absolutely necessary for salvation. And because notice, he is not saying that your faith has healed you, but your faith has saved you. And so to confirm that your sin has been washed away because of your recognition and trust in me, let me fix your eyes as the visible demonstration that you have been forgiven. Which, by the way, is the far more important issue of this text. And why Jesus explicitly says it. You have been saved. And that this is about salvation is evidence here in verse 43. And so notice Luke says this. He says, and immediately he regained his sight and began following him in glorifying God. Now, two verbs here to notice that give the marks of genuine conversion. That is what this is. And so again, in contrast to the two verbs that typified the rich young ruler, which up in verse 23, where remember that he walked away, and then the other gospel accounts add that he walked away very sad or afflicted of soul. Notice this man, in contrast to that, follows Jesus, a term of obedience, and then he glorifies God, which is a term of worship from the heart. So very stark contrast here. And because a true Christian is one who lives a life of obedience, following after Jesus, and then worships him from the heart. Full of joy, full of thanksgiving. And it is noticeable by all. It is not just a private little thing. It becomes life-dominating. And so this man, he becomes a true follower. He had a transformed heart, and it's evidenced by a transformed life. In fact, this man would follow Jesus right up into Jerusalem. He would follow him as he went to trial. He would follow him as perhaps he would carry his own cross to Golgotha. He would maybe even follow the procession perhaps that would go to bury Jesus' body in a tomb. In fact, as one man said, maybe he was even one of the 120 in the upper room in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. And because from this point on, Luke says, notice, he followed Jesus. And we don't actually know if he was one of the 120 in the upper room, but as one man said, let's put him there. And because how many names of converts are we actually given in the gospel? Answer, almost none. Which is to say then, that the reason that Mark is able to give the blind man's name, which is Bartimaeus, is because in all likelihood he became a very well-known figure in the early church as a model of faith. And not to mention that all 120 who would have been in the upper room would have been here present at this event. And because remember, this is just days before Jesus' death, which means we are about 50 days or so out from Pentecost. And it's hard to imagine that this man would defect from his faith just 50 days after receiving his sight. Not to mention, Jesus has just declared him saved. And so this is a special man. This is a unique man in the history of the church. And his faith here is so profound that his name has been permanently inscribed in the record of eternal Scripture. And so if you're a Christian here this morning, then one day you will meet Bartimaeus. And then just very quickly, notice the final element of this story, verse 43. And we're left here with the final description of the crowd. Luke says this, he says, and when all the people saw it, they gave praise to God. Now, what you need to know about this response is that it is 100% superficial. This is superficial. And why? Well, because this is the crowd. And the crowd is the category of people in Luke, we've seen this all throughout the gospel, who are typified by a neutral, half-hearted, half-devoted, consumeristic, emotionalistic approach to Jesus, and who follow him, frankly, for his spectacles. They're after the healings. They're after the miracles. They're after his bread. They're after his potentiation for ending the corruption of the religious system who keeps robbing them of their money because the religious elite crush the people with their burdens. And so it's all superficial. In other words, they are the rich young ruler. That is the contrast of this chapter. They followed after Jesus for some superficial needs, hoping he's going to fill some temporary vision of the kingdom. And so they see the miracle here, and what do? They burst out in praise. In fact, coming off of the resurrection of Lazarus, which happened just days prior to this event in a place called Bethany, takes place in John chapter 11. But that event mixed now with this miracle is what will trigger the massive outpouring of praise and all the fanfare and all the excitement that will reach its apex in the triumphant entry. Just days from this. These miracles are fueling that mob of hypocrisy that expresses itself in false praise. Let me begin to bring this to a close by saying that Jesus came for far more than meeting temporary needs. He is the sovereign king. He is the sovereign Lord over everything, including sickness, including disease. But he came, hear this, he came primarily for the soul. That is why he has come. He has come, he said, to seek and to save the lost. And so I love this account, and because before he goes up to the cross to make a sacrifice for sin, he comes low to collect for himself this forgotten sinner for whom he's about to die. And then he will bring him with him as he begins his ascent, all the way to the cross. And so the question of the text here for us this morning is so where are you? Where are you? Where do you personally fit into this passage? Do you see your need? And in seeing your need, have you made the confession of Jesus as Lord? And then in making the confession of Jesus as Lord, do you follow him in obedience and worship from the heart? In fact, notice the final detail of this text, and it's easily missed, but it's significant. Notice how Bartimaeus is described in verse 43. He is described again as following Jesus, again, a term of obedience. But then notice the thematic contrast with the superficial crowd in verse 39. Notice how Luke describes them. What does he say? He says, notice, they are leading the way. Leading the way, which is to say what? Rhetorically. Well, it's to say, at the very least, that they do not follow. They do not obey. And so let me just end here this morning by saying that there are only two kinds of people in this room this morning. There are followers, and then there are frauds. There are those who are needy and desperate and lowly and spiritually seeing and following and obeying and joyfully worshiping from the heart. And then there's the spiritually blind, self-deluded, who've in some way identified themselves merely with Jesus of Nazareth. In a sense, there are those who are in, and then there are those who are only intrigued. There are those who glorify God from the heart, and then there are those who merely offer words of praise from the mouth. In fact, that change of verb at the end of verse 43 is so important. Notice that. Point of Luke is to say that they might be praising God, but they're just words. They're just words. That is the contrast to make, and it's an eternal one. And by the way, those words will turn into cries for Jesus' blood just days from this moment. And because what you cry from the heart is what you really desire and what you really believe. Bartimaeus cries for mercy, but these who only offer words of praise will cry for his blood. And so the real application of this text is, so to which group do you belong this morning? That is the question. Who are you? And I want you to think about yourself. And actually think about yourself. Are you like Bartimaeus? Or are you just part of the excited, superficial group who identifies, for now, with Jesus? And you're even excited about it. Fact is, we have people here every single week. I don't know who you are, but you come, you sit in these chairs, you listen week after week after week as Jesus, in a sense, passes you by, as you see him in all of his wonder and all of his glory and all of his majesty in this gospel. And maybe you find it interesting, maybe you find it intriguing, maybe you're just bored, but maybe you're curious. Maybe you take the Lord's Supper. Maybe you sing words of praise to God during our music portion. But the fact is, when it really comes down to it, you're just part of the crowd. And because you do not follow in obedience from the heart, in thought and word and deed, and why? Because Jesus is not Lord of your life. He's just what you've signed on to and identified with for now. And so for some of you, you need to see spiritually what you do not yet see. What you need to see is that, well, you might sign on to Jesus because it's the nice thing to do and it contains some good morality and you want to raise your kids in a nice, friendly community. What you need to see this morning, and I pray you see it, is that unless you follow Jesus as Lord with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind and all of your strength, after having come to an end of yourself, you're just a superficial seeker. And the way that you know if you're a superficial seeker or not is, what is your life producing? What's it producing? And because, as Jesus himself would say often, you will know them how? By their fruit. The fruit of their life. The sign of this man's faith, hear this, it wasn't his profession, ultimately. It was his transformed life. He began following Jesus' obedience in glorifying God from the heart. His faith was undeniable. The question is yours. And I pray that all of us are blind Bartimaeus, who though he could not see, he was the one who saw. If you've not come to Christ this morning, then do not let him pass you by, for this is the hour, perhaps the providential hour of your salvation. And if you don't know what that means, or you're not sure if you're a Christian, but you want to be, then like Bartimaeus, ask. You have to ask. Come and talk with me. But see your need, see Jesus for who he is, and then cry out. For he will always stop for the lowly of heart. So cry out to him, even now. Let's pray.